The most dangerous thing about The Little Prince is that millions of people believe it's a book about childhood. It isn't. In fact, you could argue that it's one of the most unsettling books ever written about adulthood. Because beneath the drawings, beneath the stars, beneath the gentle language, there is a question that becomes harder to ignore the older you get. What if growing up is not the problem? What if the real tragedy is something else entirely? What if, somewhere along the way, we quietly stopped feeling alive? Most readers approach this book expecting nostalgia. They expect a reminder of innocence, imagination, and the magic of being young. But that assumption creates a blind spot. Because the story spends surprisingly little time celebrating children and an extraordinary amount of time examining adults. And not evil adults. Not cruel adults. Not villains. Something much more uncomfortable. Adults who function perfectly. Adults who are productive. Adults who are respected. Adults who have goals, responsibilities, schedules, and accomplishments. Adults who appear completely normal. So why do they feel so empty? That question sits at the center of the entire work like a hidden gravity field pulling everything toward it. And the strange thing is that the book never attacks intelligence, ambition, or success. Its criticism runs much deeper. It points toward a kind of spiritual numbness that can hide beneath all of those things. Imagine a person standing under a sky filled with stars. They can calculate distances. They can measure value. They can categorize and organize what they see. But they can no longer feel wonder. That image may be more important than any single character in the book. Because the central conflict is not children versus adults. It is wonder versus numbness. Presence versus automation. Meaning versus function. And once you see that conflict, something disturbing begins to emerge. The adults portrayed throughout the work are not random personalities. They operate more like symptoms. Fragments of a larger condition. Each one reveals a different way a human being can become disconnected from what makes life meaningful while still appearing successful on the surface. That raises an uncomfortable possibility. Could this book be describing not a few unusual individuals, but an entire civilization? After all, modern society rewards efficiency. It rewards productivity. It rewards measurable outcomes. But what happens when a culture becomes exceptionally good at counting things and gradually forgets why those things mattered in the first place? A person can spend decades building a career, accumulating achievements, checking every box, and still experience a quiet sense that something essential has disappeared. Not because they failed, because they succeeded at the wrong game. That is where the book becomes far more than a story. It becomes a diagnosis. A warning hidden inside a fable. A mirror disguised as a fairy tale. And perhaps the most haunting image is not a king, a businessman, or any of the figures readers remember. Perhaps it is something much simpler. A grown adult staring at the sky and seeing nothing. No mystery. No beauty. No invitation. Just data. Because if that capacity for wonder truly disappears, the consequences reach far beyond personal happiness. Love changes. Relationships change. The way we see other people changes. The way we see ourselves changes. And if enough people lose that ability at the same time, the problem is no longer individual. It becomes cultural. But before we ask what this condition does to a society, we need to answer a more unsettling question. What exactly is the thing that these adults lost? And why does The Little Prince suggest that most of them never even realized it was gone? To understand what was lost, we first have to understand something even stranger. The book never presents adulthood as a sudden failure. It presents it as a gradual trade. A series of exchanges so small that almost nobody notices them happening. Wonder is traded for certainty. Presence is traded for efficiency. Meaning is traded for measurement. And because each trade appears reasonable on its own, the final result feels normal. That may be why the condition is so difficult to recognize. After all, when people think about losing themselves, they imagine a dramatic collapse. A crisis. A visible breakdown. But what if the real danger works differently? What if the deepest losses happen quietly? What if the most important parts of a person disappear while everything on the outside continues functioning perfectly? This is where one symbol becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine a businessman spending every waking hour counting stars. Not admiring them. Not wondering about them. Not being transformed by them. Just counting. At first glance, that seems absurd. But look closer. The stars are not the point. The counting is. Because the moment something becomes valuable only when it can be measured, a subtle shift takes place. And that shift extends far beyond one character. It appears in careers. In relationships. In education. In entire cultures. The question is no longer, what does this mean? The question becomes, what is this worth? And those are not the same question. That distinction may be one of the most important insights hidden beneath the surface. Because meaning and value often travel together at first. Then one day they separate. And many people never realize it happened. A person can earn more money than they ever imagined. Gain status. Gain recognition. Gain influence. And still feel an emptiness they cannot explain. Not because they lack success. Because success cannot answer a question it was never designed to answer. The contradiction is profound. Modern life teaches us to optimize everything. Our schedules. Our productivity. Our goals. Our performance. But the experiences that make life feel meaningful rarely arrive through optimization. Friendship cannot be optimized. Wonder cannot be optimized. Love cannot be optimized. Presence cannot be optimized. The more aggressively we try to turn them into systems, the more they seem to slip away. And suddenly another symbol begins to make sense. A single flower. Objectively insignificant. One flower among countless others. Yet somehow capable of carrying more meaning than an entire universe of interchangeable things. Why? Because significance is not created by rarity alone. It is created through attention. Through care. Through relationship. Through the willingness to give a piece of your life to something. That idea challenges one of the deepest assumptions of modern culture. We are taught that meaning comes from acquiring. But what if meaning comes from attachment? What if the things that matter most become valuable precisely because we choose them? That possibility changes everything. It means the crisis at the heart of the book is not intellectual. It is relational. The adults are not suffering from a lack of information. They are suffering from a loss of connection. Connection to other people. Connection to beauty. Connection to mystery. Connection to themselves. And once that connection weakens, a strange transformation begins. The world becomes flatter. Predictable. Manageable. Efficient. Yet somehow less alive. Like a person staring at a night sky filled with thousands of stars and seeing only numbers. Like a traveler crossing a vast desert and noticing only the sand, never realizing that somewhere beneath it lies water. And that raises a deeper question. If meaning is not lost because people become older, but because they become disconnected, then who, or what, is actually responsible for that disconnection? Is it society? Is it ambition? Is it fear? Or is there something inside human nature itself that slowly teaches us to stop seeing what was always there? But what if the force that disconnects people is not imposed from the outside? What if it begins as a survival strategy? That possibility changes the entire conversation. Because it is easy to blame society. It is easy to blame institutions, technology, or culture. Yet the deeper contradiction is that many of the habits that eventually drain meaning from life begin as solutions to real problems. Certainty reduces anxiety. Control creates stability. Efficiency saves time. Achievement earns security. None of these things are inherently destructive. In fact, they often help people build successful lives. So why do they so often seem connected to the emptiness we have been exploring? The answer may lie in a paradox hidden beneath the surface of human nature. The same psychological mechanisms that help us navigate reality can also prevent us from experiencing it. Think about what happens when something becomes familiar. The first time you see a mountain range, it captures your attention. The 100th time, your mind barely notices. The first time you hear a loved one's voice, it feels significant. Years later, it can fade into the background. The first time you look up at a sky filled with stars, you feel awe. Eventually, you stop looking. Not because the stars changed. Because your attention did. This is the contradiction at the heart of the crisis. Human beings adapt. And adaptation is both a gift and a danger. It allows us to survive difficult circumstances. But it can also make miracles invisible. That is why the central figures in this story are so unsettling. They are not monsters. They are ordinary people trapped inside their own adaptations. Each one represents a different way of becoming disconnected from reality while remaining perfectly functional within it. The ruler represents the illusion of control. The businessman represents the illusion of ownership. The drunkard represents the illusion of escape. The geographer represents the illusion of knowledge. Notice what all of these illusions share. They are substitutes. Each one offers a replacement for direct experience. A replacement for wonder. A replacement for presence. A replacement for relationship. And that is where the scale of the problem suddenly expands. Because these are not merely individual weaknesses. They are patterns. Patterns that appear across entire societies. A civilization can become obsessed with control. A civilization can become obsessed with accumulation. A civilization can become obsessed with information. A civilization can become obsessed with distraction. And when enough people participate in those patterns, they begin to feel normal. Even inevitable. Even wise. That may be the most dangerous stage of all. When spiritual numbness stops looking like a problem and starts looking like maturity. When cynicism is mistaken for intelligence. When detachment is mistaken for strength. When constant busyness is mistaken for purpose. At that point, people no longer recognize what they have lost. A person standing in a desert eventually stops searching for water if they become convinced water does not exist. And that image matters. Because one of the recurring symbols in this work is not abundance. It is absence. A vast empty landscape. A quiet space. A place where distractions disappear. Why? Because sometimes the things that matter most become visible only after everything else is stripped away. That is why another contradiction begins to emerge. The adults believe they are seeing reality clearly. Yet they are often trapped inside abstractions. The childlike perspective appears naive. Yet it repeatedly exposes truths hidden behind those abstractions. Who, then, is actually seeing the world more accurately? The person who measures everything? Or the person who still notices what cannot be measured? That question becomes increasingly uncomfortable when applied to modern life. Because the more advanced a society becomes, the easier it becomes to mistake information for wisdom. Knowledge for understanding. Connection for relationship. Activity for meaning. And once those substitutions become permanent, something profound begins to happen. People stop asking why. They continue moving. Continue producing. Continue consuming. But the deeper questions disappear. What makes a life meaningful? What is worth caring about? What deserves our attention? And perhaps most importantly, what is worth loving? Which leads to a revelation that has been quietly forming beneath everything we have discussed so far. Maybe the greatest threat is not that people lose their sense of wonder. Maybe the loss of wonder is only a symptom. The real mystery may be something deeper. What if wonder dies only after something even more fundamental has already been abandoned? What if the thing that was abandoned was not wonder, not innocence, and not imagination, but attention itself? That possibility leads us into a much deeper revelation. Because throughout this entire journey, the most important figures are not teaching a lesson about how to think. They are revealing a forgotten truth about what deserves attention. And that distinction changes everything. We often assume that meaning is something hidden somewhere in the world, waiting to be discovered by intelligent people. But the deeper message emerging here suggests the opposite. Meaning is not found first. Meaning is created through attention. The flower becomes the perfect symbol of this idea. Not because it is extraordinary. Not because it is unique. But because someone chose to care about it. This is the revelation hiding beneath the surface. The things that shape a human life are rarely the largest things. They are the things that receive sustained attention, responsibility, and devotion. That is why the flower functions as far more than a character or an object. It becomes a symbol of chosen meaning. A symbol of commitment in a world obsessed with options. A symbol of depth in a culture increasingly attracted to endless novelty. And here the contradiction becomes even sharper. Modern society constantly expands our choices. More information. More entertainment. More opportunities. More connections. Yet many people report feeling less meaning, not more. Why? Because abundance can create a strange illusion. The illusion that value exists somewhere else. Somewhere better. Somewhere still waiting to be found. As a result, attention becomes fragmented. Commitment weakens. Relationships become replaceable. Experiences become temporary. The pursuit of meaning becomes endless because nothing is ever allowed to become truly meaningful. Imagine a person standing in front of 10,000 stars and feeling nothing because there are too many to count. Now imagine another person caring deeply about a single flower. Which person is actually richer? That question reveals a hidden conflict running beneath modern life. We are trained to maximize access. But meaning often emerges through limitation. Through choosing. Through caring. Through staying. The figure of the fox becomes especially important here. Its role is not to provide information. Its influence comes from exposing a forgotten law of human existence: relationships transform perception. The contradiction is profound. Before attachment, something appears ordinary. After attachment, the same thing becomes irreplaceable. The world does not change. Vision changes. And once vision changes, reality itself feels different. This has consequences far beyond personal happiness. Because civilizations are ultimately built from collective attention. What a society chooses to notice becomes culture. What it chooses to ignore slowly disappears. If attention is directed primarily toward efficiency, efficiency becomes sacred. If attention is directed primarily toward consumption, consumption becomes identity. If attention is directed primarily toward status, status becomes purpose. The crisis we have been exploring therefore extends beyond individuals. It becomes a civilizational question. What happens when an entire culture loses the ability to devote deep attention to anything that cannot be measured, optimized, or monetized? Suddenly another memory fragment comes into focus. A quiet well hidden beneath a vast desert. Not visible from a distance. Not obvious. Not impressive. Yet containing exactly what is needed for life. The most important things are often like that. Invisible until someone learns how to look. And that leads to a revelation that changes the shape of everything we have discussed so far. Perhaps the central problem is not that people stopped seeing meaning. Perhaps people stopped practicing the kind of attention that makes meaning possible in the first place. But if meaning is created through attention, responsibility, and devotion, then a far more unsettling question emerges. What happens to a person who spends years giving their attention to things that can never truly love them back? What happens when a human being gives years of attention to things that can never truly return meaning? That question brings us to the deepest revelation hidden within the entire work. The crisis has never been about growing older. It has never been about losing imagination. It has never even been about becoming too practical. The real crisis is far more fundamental. Human beings are creatures of relationship. Not merely social creatures. Relational creatures. We become what we devote ourselves to. We become shaped by what we repeatedly love, protect, pursue, and serve. That is the core revelation. The book is not ultimately asking what adults have forgotten. It is asking what adults have chosen to worship instead. Look carefully at the symbolic landscape that has emerged throughout our journey. A flower. A fox. A well hidden beneath a desert. None of these symbols represent achievement. None represent status. None represent power. They all point toward the same invisible principle. Meaning emerges through relationship. Not possession. Not control. Not accumulation. Relationship. This explains why the most important figures in the story operate less like characters and more like mirrors. Their role is not to entertain. Their influence is to reveal competing visions of human existence. One vision treats life as something to manage. The other treats life as something to encounter. One vision seeks ownership. The other seeks connection. One seeks certainty. The other accepts mystery. And here the deepest contradiction finally becomes visible. Modern culture often teaches that freedom means having fewer obligations. Yet the symbols at the center of this work suggest the opposite. The things that give life meaning are often the very things that limit us. Responsibility. Commitment. Care. Devotion. At first glance, these appear restrictive. But they create depth. They transform ordinary experiences into meaningful ones. A flower becomes irreplaceable because someone accepts responsibility for it. A friendship becomes sacred because someone invests attention into it. A life becomes meaningful because someone decides that certain things matter more than everything else. This is why the hidden conflict is not between childhood and adulthood. It is between relationship and abstraction. The adults trapped inside abstraction become disconnected from reality because reality is always relational. You cannot spreadsheet your way into meaning. You cannot optimize your way into belonging. You cannot calculate your way into love. The tools are useful. But they cannot answer the questions they were never designed to answer. And the consequences extend far beyond individual fulfillment. When enough people begin treating life primarily as a system of transactions, society changes. Communities weaken. Attention fragments. Human beings become resources, audiences, customers, metrics, and demographics. The language becomes more precise. Yet the experience becomes less human. Imagine a civilization filled with people who know the price of everything but feel the value of nothing. A civilization capable of measuring the stars with extraordinary accuracy while forgetting why anyone looked up in the first place. That image may be the closest thing to the central warning hidden within this work. Not the collapse of institutions. Not the collapse of economies. But the gradual collapse of meaning itself. Because when people lose meaningful relationships, they do not merely lose happiness. They lose orientation. They lose the ability to recognize what is worth sacrificing for, what is worth protecting, and what is worth becoming. Which leads to an unsettling philosophical possibility. If meaning is born from relationship, responsibility, and devotion, then the future of a person, a culture, or even a civilization may depend on a single question. What kinds of things are we teaching ourselves to love? The consequences of this revelation are much larger than they first appear. Because if a meaningful life is shaped by what receives our devotion, then every act of attention becomes a kind of vote for the person we are becoming. That means the real cost of spiritual numbness is not emotional discomfort. It is transformation. Slow. Quiet. Almost invisible transformation. Human beings are shaped by their habits of attention in the same way rivers are shaped by the paths water follows over time. At first, the changes seem insignificant. A little less curiosity. A little less presence. A little less wonder. But years later, the landscape is completely different. This is why the legacy of the ideas hidden within this work extends far beyond literature. They challenge one of the deepest assumptions of modern life, the belief that external success and internal fulfillment naturally move together. The warning is not that success is dangerous. The warning is that success can become so consuming that people forget to ask what it is serving. Imagine someone spending decades climbing a ladder only to discover they no longer recognize the person who reached the top. The achievement is real. The effort was real. Yet something essential was left behind during the ascent. That image functions as a memory fragment not because it is dramatic, but because it is familiar. Many people recognize pieces of themselves in it. And this is where the influence of the symbolic figures becomes enduring. Their legacy is not tied to a specific time period or culture. They represent recurring human patterns. The urge to control. The urge to accumulate. The urge to escape uncertainty. The urge to replace living experience with abstraction. These tendencies did not disappear when the book was written. If anything, they have become easier to indulge. Today, a person can spend hours each day surrounded by information yet feel disconnected from wisdom. Surrounded by communication yet feel isolated. Surrounded by entertainment yet feel restless. The paradox grows larger as society becomes more advanced. More tools. More access. More convenience. Yet the central human questions remain unchanged. What deserves our attention? What deserves our loyalty? What deserves our life? That is why the deepest legacy of this work may not be its characters or symbols. It may be its ability to expose a hidden cost that modern culture rarely discusses. The cost of neglecting the inner life. Because when people lose contact with that dimension of existence, the consequences ripple outward. Relationships become transactional. Communities become fragile. Purpose becomes confused with productivity. Even identity begins to drift. A person can become highly skilled at performing a role while slowly forgetting who is performing it. The scale of this insight reaches beyond individuals and into entire civilizations. Every culture is ultimately built upon collective habits of attention. The things a society rewards become the things people pursue. The things it ignores gradually disappear from public consciousness. Which means the future is shaped not only by technology, economics, or politics, but by something far more subtle. What people choose to notice. Consider one final image. A traveler standing in a vast desert at night. Above them, countless stars. Beneath them, hidden water. Around them, silence. To one person, the scene appears empty. To another, it feels full of meaning. The desert did not change. The stars did not change. The hidden well did not change. Only perception changed. And perhaps that is why these ideas continue to endure. They force us to confront a mystery that remains unresolved. If meaning has always been available beneath the surface of ordinary life, why do so many people pass by it without ever seeing it at all? And more importantly, is that blindness something imposed upon us, or something we quietly choose ourselves? Perhaps that is why this story continues to survive generation after generation. Not because it provides answers, but because it refuses to let certain questions die. Long after the final page is turned, the symbols remain. A single flower. A fox. A desert beneath a sky filled with stars. A hidden well waiting beneath the sand. These images endure because they point toward something that cannot be fully explained, only recognized. They speak to a part of human experience that exists beneath achievement, beneath identity, beneath the roles we spend our lives performing. And perhaps that is the final insight. The most important things in life are often invisible not because they are hidden from us, but because they exist in a dimension we cannot access through analysis alone. We live in a world that encourages us to look outward. To seek more information. More certainty. More control. Yet some truths reveal themselves only when attention shifts inward. Not toward self-absorption, but toward awareness. Toward presence. Toward the quiet recognition that life is not merely something to be managed. It is something to be encountered. The lasting legacy of this work is not literary. It is human. It reminds us that beneath every system, every ambition, every success, there remains a person searching for meaning. A person longing for connection. A person hoping that what they give their life to truly matters. That search has never disappeared. It simply changes its appearance. Sometimes it looks like achievement. Sometimes it looks like restlessness. Sometimes it looks like the feeling that something essential is missing even when everything seems fine. And that may be why the symbols remain so powerful. The flower is no longer just a flower. It becomes a reminder that value emerges where care is given. The hidden well is no longer just water. It becomes a reminder that what sustains life is often buried beneath what distracts us. The stars are no longer distant lights in the sky. They become a reminder that mystery still exists beyond the limits of what can be measured. Together, they form a quiet challenge to the modern mind. Not a rejection of progress. Not a rejection of knowledge. But a question about balance. A question about whether human beings can remain deeply alive while moving through a world increasingly designed to capture, divide, and monetize their attention. Because the danger was never that people would stop thinking. The danger was that they would stop noticing. Stop noticing beauty. Stop noticing meaning. Stop noticing one another. And perhaps, eventually, stop noticing themselves. In the end, the deepest conflict was never between youth and age, innocence and experience, imagination and reality. It was between two ways of inhabiting existence. One treats the world as a collection of objects. The other treats it as a web of relationships. One asks, what can I gain from this? The other asks, what responsibility does this place upon me? And the answer to that question may shape an entire life. Because what we choose to care about becomes what we learn to see. What we learn to see becomes the world we live in. And so the final mystery is not hidden in a desert, a star, or a distant planet. It is much closer than that. If meaning has always been waiting within the ordinary moments of life, then when we reach the end of our journey, will we discover that the world had become empty, or that we had simply forgotten how to look?